time. Got it. Perfect. Great.
Sorry.
No problem. So we know what these moose are actually eating in our forests. And it's really important. They like birch. So when you think about the health of your forest or the state or condition of your forest, young regenerating forests tend to have a lot more birch in them. And they have some maple trees in them. And you guys might even have some hemlock if you have some wettish areas. You might not have balsam fir because fir tend to grow a slightly higher elevation. So I don't know if you guys have those. And I'm not sure if you have hobblebush, but moose love hobblebush. So we know what they're kind of eating. And obviously when I said they eat 25 kilograms of material a day, that means that they ingest a lot of stuff. And so a moose can actually produce about 5 kilograms of feces or poop a day. If you've walked around in your forest, deer pellets are a lot smaller and moose pellets are a lot larger. So you will know if you have moose around, if you come across great big pellets that are much larger than you would normally see deer pellet size. So maybe you guys have some moose in your area. You could walk around the forest and see if you can find any moose poop like this. So one of the interesting things about moose poop, here I am working with, and this is like way back in 2001 or 2 or something like that. This particular poop is very special poop. I flew all the way to Alaska to feed a captive moose a labeled isotopic material, meaning I added a heavy isotope that I could then trace. It's not radioactive or anything like that. It's just a heavy isotope that when I analyze nitrogen, there's a light nitrogen and there's a heavy nitrogen. And if I use an instrument that is specialized to determine the differences in the masses of these two kinds of isotopic signatures in nitrogen, I can determine how much of that nitrogen came from my special poop. So this poop took a lot of effort to collect and then fly all the way back to New Hampshire. And that's a time for another story. If anybody wants to ask, I'd be happy to talk about that later. So what happens with all this poop? Well, if you guys have deer, do you all have deer in your forests?
Yes.
Yeah, a bunch of deer. Yeah. I'm seeing, well, thumbs up. You may like to see them because they're rather beautiful, right? Yeah, but they certainly eat a lot of stuff. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's happening with the changes in moose versus deer populations and why we're thinking about the implications of climate change, how that's going to change populations of moose and populations of deer. So the reason I study these big herbivores who eat plants and then poop a lot is that these animals have 2 different kinds of impacts on plants. We think about direct effects where, imagine a deer or a sheep or a cow or a moose eating a plant. And the plant can do one of 2 things. It can either respond in a positive way, kind of like, when you mow your lawn, you don't kill your grass, the lawn grows back again. So you've stimulated, my dog, sorry, one of them is whining to come over here. If you mow your lawn, you stimulate the grass to actually grow faster again. And the more you mow your lawn, and if you give it plenty of water and it's got lots of light, it keeps growing. So it's kind of what happens with some plants that get eaten by animals. The plant can respond in a positive way and continue to grow. And it oftentimes has a higher nitrogen content in its leaves than before it got eaten. So there's this positive feedback happening between the poop and pee that the animal deposits on the plant. So it's kind of fertilizing it. And then the plant grows faster in that response from that herbivory. That's one alternative. The other alternative is that the plant can't handle it. So you might have plants in your yard or in your forest that get eaten by deer. And if the deer eat too much of the plant, the response of the plant is, I can't do this, I'm going to die. So what happens in your forest or in your garden is that the plants that the animals don't like to eat, like say that the deer don't like to eat, they then start doing really well. And the plants that maybe you liked or other animals liked get eaten can't handle getting browsed and they die. So they're removed from that community, whether it's your garden or your forest. So over here, what I'm showing is that we start out with a plant that maybe had an amount of nitrogen in its leaves that was, I'm just saying, for example, here, 1% nitrogen. When we convert that forest into trees that have a lower nitrogen content, again, this is sort of a relationship between animals and plants. Deer don't like plants that have low nitrogen content. So those plants do well. And all of a sudden your forest is taken over by these plants, fine enough plants, but they don't get eaten by deer. Moose, on the other hand, will keep eating them a little bit. And so these two ways that herbivores impact both the plant community composition and the nitrogen content, the nutrient cycling, is something that I spend a lot of time working on. Does that make sense to everybody?
Yes. And so, and the shift of, we discussed the shift of plant life despite our native species desire. Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So moose tend to be functioning over here where they have a direct positive effect. Eating plants, plants still grow, they get fertilized by the moose. So moose tend not to kill plants. Yes, they could, but not in the same way that deer do. Deer come in and they heavily browse their preferred species that have high nitrogen content. So deer tend to shift at high densities when there's a lot of deer. They tend to shift a forest into a different community structure. So you're changing the kinds of plant species that are in a forest where there's a lot of deer. In a forest where there's a lot of moose, there's got to be a lot of moose to be able to make that change happen. It could happen, but it happens a lot more rarely. So the other thing that Jessica brought up is that I actually study climate change. So I'm interested in how winter climate change and that plant-animal interaction is going to alter our forest in the future. So if you imagine right now, if you've got places that have higher elevations, we tend to see evergreen trees at higher elevation, and we tend to see our deciduous, like our maple trees, our birch trees, a little bit at lower elevation. And we think that as the future is going to get warmer, as we've seen over the past 30 years, we believe that those deciduous trees like it a little bit warmer and that they're actually going to start advancing upslope. Meaning instead of having deciduous trees just down at low elevation, they're actually going to make it all the way to the tops of high elevation. And our evergreen trees are going to be crowded right at the very tippy top of the high elevation zones. So that's going to change where deer and moose are going to hang out, and other animals as well. And so I've been really, people have been modeling this kind of response in our forests. And so I'm really interested in how moose are going to interact with that. And so that's part of what I'm going to tell you a little bit about today. These are some research questions that I have, and I have a lot more, but I kind of wanted to pull us back to, I study animals, moose, deer, and how they eat plants, but ultimately I do want to know how they're affecting nutrient dynamics. So how they're affecting nitrogen in the soil and how that nitrogen is either decreasing or increasing. So some of my questions are interested in how stuff decomposes or breaks down, and when leaf material and dead plant material decomposes and breaks down, does that nitrogen go back to the plants? Does it get stored in the soil, or does it go someplace else? And how are moose and climate change interacting with that? And then this last question is a really important one, because if we think about different plants that are getting eaten by these different big animals, herbivores, some plants, as I showed you, have a positive response to that herbivory, and some plants have a negative response, like they end up dying. But I want to know, why are they dying? Is it just because too much green stuff has been eaten off? Or do they not have access to the nitrogen that might be coming in from the feces and urine that the big animal is putting back into the environment? So that's where that special isotope labeled poop comes in. I can actually trace it from the poop into the soil, into the microorganisms, and back into the plant again. And so I found some interesting things. Who knew moose poop could be so interesting and exciting, right? Anyhow, if you've ever walked in the forest and you've picked up a maple leaf in the fall, you know, the leaves have fallen off the tree, or you have them in your yard and you're raking your yard up, the maple leaves are kind of thin and crumbly, right? When they first fall off the tree, they're a little thicker, but pretty soon, if you don't rake your yard and you just wait for the wind to sort of blow stuff around, by the time December hits, if you still haven't raked your yard and you have a whole bunch of maple trees, you're probably okay not to rake your yard. If you have oak leaves and oak trees in your yard, you got a whole bunch of leaves that are just going to hang out there and they're not going to break down very fast. So they're really thick and they're kind of leathery. So I'm very interested in how the forest community structure is responding to climate change, and in this case, soil freezing. So these clear bars here represent the reference or plots that have a lot of snow on them in the wintertime, meaning that the soils have a blanket on top of them and the soil doesn't freeze. The black bars are the treatment where, I don't know about you all, maybe you don't like shoveling snow anymore, and I particularly am not fond of shoveling snow in my driveway in the wintertime. But as a research scientist, we go out into the middle of the woods in the wintertime and we go shovel snow off our plots. So we can make a freezing event happen by actually removing snow. So these black bars represent plots that we've taken snow off of them all winter long so that we can freeze the soil. And what I'm showing you here is maple litter. So litter that falls off the tree. So it's the fall time. Maple trees drop their leaves onto the forest floor. We collect them and then we put them in our plots so that we know how much we put in, and then we trace them over almost 2 years. And then we weigh them again at the end of 2 years and we see how much is left at the end of 2 years. And if you're maple litter and the soil doesn't freeze, there's more decomposition, meaning this is the amount of mass remaining. So there's less mass remaining if the soils are nice and warm. If the soils are cold and frozen, there's more of the litter remaining, and that means that decomposition has slowed down. Decomposition, if you guys add compost to your gardens, one of the reasons you add compost to your garden is not only to improve the health of your soil for your gardening, but you're also adding nutrients. And so these dead leaves are providing nutrients to the forest soil community. So when we have frozen soils, it looks like decomposition is slowed down. So the return of nutrients back to the forest community is slowing down. So it's not returning as fast as if you had nice warm soils covered by a blanket of snow in the wintertime. And if you happen to be a big animal eating any of those plants, well, it doesn't matter if your poop gets frozen or not frozen. It decomposes at about the same rate if you're frozen or non-frozen. However, animal feces decomposes way faster than plant material. And again, if you think about an animal ate plant material, so it did all the hard stuff, like it broke it all down, and then what it couldn't break down, that's what it digested. So that stuff is really yummy for the organisms who are in the soil who are going to do that final breakdown of the material. So you might think about your garden, a whole bunch of earthworms in your garden or pill bugs. Those pill bugs or earthworms are breaking down that compost, making it even more available for your plants that are going to grow. And that's what these big herbivores are doing in our forests. They're eating plant material. They're putting a lot of poop back out into the environment, and that poop is now breaking down and releasing nutrients back to the forest community. So the nitrogen that's in that plant material or moose poop, is it actually getting used by plants? And what I'm showing you here is, remember that special isotope label moose poop? It lets me find out when I measure these plants if the nitrogen in the moose poop ends up in the plant or doesn't end up in the plant. And so over here again on the left side of the screen, you see the reference plots. These are the plots that aren't frozen. So these have lots of snow on them in the wintertime, And so the soils don't freeze. If I put moose poop on these plants, balsam fir seedlings in the forest, and they're protected with snow, oh, look, they actually get some of the nitrogen from the moose poop. If I'm sugar maple, they don't get any. So sugar maple doesn't seem to be able to get access to nitrogen from moose poop. And if I'm that hobble bush, that viburnum, I also have access to the nitrogen coming from moose poop. But look at how much, if I'm a balsam fir and my soil is not frozen, I have a larger amount than if I'm just getting eaten by a moose. So if I'm getting eaten by a moose and I have a blanket of snow on me, the plant has been compromised. It took up a lot of the plant material, so the plant doesn't have as much uptake anymore. So there's less available. However, if I am eaten by a moose and pooped on by a moose and my soil is frozen, I have a lot of access to it. But these other plants have no access to it. So balsam fir seems to have a relationship in changing climate conditions, in changing soil conditions to get access to that nitrogen coming from moose poop. But when these other plants, sugar maple or viburnum, are either stressed or just growing in the forest with regular snowfall, they don't seem to have access to the nitrogen. So there's really interesting relationships between these plants and their big herbivores. So that was actually, this was a lot of fun to do this project. Took an awful lot of work. And the other really important thing to think about is how does this, I know this is a super busy figure and I'm not going to dwell on it. You guys don't have to look at everything. But what I'm interested in understanding is from a forest, when a forest drops all of its leaves onto the forest floor in the fall time, in the autumn, how much of the nitrogen is in the forest floor that's contributed by that leaf fall? And if a animal like a moose is coming in and eating plants and then working in a particular area or staying in a particular area, what is the contribution of nitrogen to the forest that's different than the plant contribution? And the take home here is that if you only have a few moose in your forest and they're widely distributed across your forest, moose have almost no impact on the forest nitrogen dynamics. So if I have 9 moose or 5 moose and they're roaming over 3,000 hectares of forest, it's not a big deal. But moose tend to have, in the wintertime, a much smaller space that they're operating in. So if a moose finds a good place to stay for the winter, it's not going to go roaming around everywhere. It wants to save energy because if there's a lot of deep snow, it's hard to move around. If it's got enough food in a small area, it's just going to hang out in that small area, eating what it can, saving energy by not moving around a lot. And if there aren't a lot of predators to make it have to move, it's just going to stay in that space if it's a safe place and if it's got enough food and it has enough cover. If that happens, what the moose does is all of a sudden how much nitrogen it contributes by eating and sleeping and staying and pooping and peeing in that area, the total amount of nitrogen coming into this part of the forest, a small part over a short period of the winter, is actually a pretty significant amount of nitrogen. So when we think about how animals are interacting with their forest, it's going to be based on the size of your forest and are those animals staying in that space for a long time, or are they just coming in and then going away? So maybe you all might be thinking about your own forest. How many deer do you have? Do those deer have opportunities to go someplace else, or are they concentrating their activities in your forest? So that's something that I'd be happy to talk to you all about later on.
A quick interjection, Lynn?
Yes, yes.
Does the fact that moose are so big and heavy and their feet are so large, is that affecting, especially if they do end up staying on a small area for the winter, just the literal effect of their size, the size of the poop? I mean, that must all contribute
Yeah, so if you think about it, if they're
Or
staying
no?
in this small area, like a 1 hectare area, first of all, it's in the winter time. Like once it starts everything starts to thaw and they're going around trying to find different places to eat. Moose like to eat different things in the summer than they do in the
Mm,
winter. So in the summertime, maybe you all have seen moose in wetland areas. They kind of like to go hang out in ponds because they like to eat those roots of the plants that grow in the ponds. There's a whole lot of salts in there. There's magnesium and calcium, and they really need that in the summertime. If I'm a female moose and I have a calf and I'm feeding that calf, so that calf is drinking milk, that means that mother needs more nutrients. She needs calcium, she needs magnesium. If I'm a bull moose and I'm developing my antlers, I also need magnesium and calcium and phosphorus. So they're going to go to places on the land where they can get all of those elements to be able to do that kind of growth over the summer. In the wintertime, when they're spending this concentrated activity in a smaller space, the only thing, it's not that their hooves are going to have much of an impact, but they're going to put a lot of poop out there. And as you saw, that poop is going to decompose faster than plant material, but it's not all going to decompose, which is why we can still find it in the summertime. So it's almost like a slow release capsule, if you will. So it's going to start returning nutrients for a longer period of time.
right.
So you could think about it that way. Does that help?
Yes, it does. It does. Thank you.
So do moose really matter? Absolutely. And so I had kind of wanted to sort of highlight when we think about why a lot of people are interested in moose. Clearly, I'm interested in moose because they're interacting with our forest in very unique ways. But again, moose are this iconic northern wood species. And so we think about the tourism, just like our sugar maple trees, for leaf peepers are really, really important. Moose as a tourist attraction are also important for a lot of small communities' economies. And we also, I just told you a little bit about how moose are contributing to nutrient dynamics in forests. And we know that moose are facing some challenges, changing climate. These are big animals, and these are animals who are adapted to cold weather, especially in the wintertime. And if our winters are getting warmer, and now this winter happens to have been a cold winter, and it's still bloody cold right now, as that north wind is blowing. But these animals just are not quite equipped to deal with the hot temperatures that we're experiencing more and more in the wintertime and also in the summertime. So when our temperatures are getting above 30 degrees Celsius, these animals are heat stressed. So that has a lot of serious consequences. And again, New Hampshire, New York, even Maine, again, the few moose that maybe you have in Massachusetts, we're seeing populations declining for moose in this whole big region. The other cool thing about moose is that you might think of humans as being like this great engineer, right? So we build all sorts of cool stuff. We have amazing architects. We design and build lots of cool things. Well, beavers do too. Beavers build dams and lodges, and they really transform the landscape. But these big herbivores like moose can also change the landscape, and they can create habitat for other organisms. A study that a master's student was working on, I went ahead and shoveled a whole bunch of these plants. So if you look over here, you can see moose tracks, moose poop, and you can see how the snow is really high on the sides here. So I went in over the winters and I would shovel these transect lines to expose. These happen to be viburnum hobblebush plants. And you can see if you've ever seen a hobblebush in the wintertime, it's got these great big buds as it's getting ready to put out the leaves and flowers in the springtime. Moose love those. I always describe these viburnum buds as lobster tails. So if you eat a lobster, you want to eat the tail and the claws. And so to a moose, this is like a lobster claw or a tail. And so what moose do is when their plants are exposed, so the more you shovel the plants, keep the snow low, the moose come in and eat more and more of the hobble bush. That's really important because this structure of hobble bush, typically where the snow line is, the plants below the snow line don't get eaten by moose. Anything sticking up above the snow can get eaten by a moose. So when that snow depth is more shallow or less deep, more of these plants get eaten over the winter time. Black-throated blue warblers love to nest in hobble bush. And so moose eating the plants creates like this really cool, tight architecture to the plant, and it provides nesting habitat. But if there's less and less snow and the plants are getting clipped off lower and lower and lower, that means these birds who might start nesting lower and closer to the ground are more susceptible to nest predators. So there's, on the one hand, moose are generating this cool structure in hobblebush for nesting habitat quality. That means there's more green leaves for caterpillars, so there's more food for the birds. But if those nests and those sort of really densely packed leaves and branches are happening lower and lower, closer to the ground, these birds are again more susceptible to nest predation. So climate change is indirectly affecting this relationship, or sort of an indirect partnership between moose browsing and habitat for nesting birds. This is a little bit outdated, but this is me doing a transition now. We looked at the population of deer, moose, and black bear, both at Hubbard Brook and New Hampshire Fish and Game. And the circles are deer populations, and the dashed lines are New Hampshire Fish and Game data. The solid lines are our data at Hubbard Brook. The squares are moose and the triangles are bears. And what you see here for deer at Hubbard Brook, back in the 80s, there were a lot more deer, and then they kind of declined a lot, and then they really crashed. But we're starting to see this big uptick. So we're starting to see a lot more deer in our region, probably as you all have more deer in your region. And moose have been kind of at this low constant level, although we did see an uptick at Hubbard Brook in about 2005. And we've been pretty stable since 2010 at, maybe 7 or 8 animals in our particular region that we're working in. So over those 3,000 hectares, we're seeing about 7 animals, moose, occupying that space. That's not terrible, but it's starting to change. And black bear have always been pretty low in population. And we'll come back to why black bear are important. So why do we think we're seeing this decrease in moose and an increase in deer? Well, I just told you a little bit about temperature intolerance in moose. So they're big animals, they're really cold adapted. And so when it's warm in the wintertime, it's too warm for them. We might be happy, but they're not happy. And they also are experience extreme heat stress in the summertime when it gets really hot. We also know that there's an increase in parasites. And we know that their food resources are changing. As we have these freezing events in the wintertime, some plant species aren't doing well. And we also have changes in the overall condition of our forest. So as our forests are aging, there's less food available for moose, which is why we tend to see when you cut down some forest and new trees start to regenerate, that's when we have the most amount of food available for these large animals. We as people manage our land in such a way that doesn't allow animals to sort of move around contiguously. So we know that sometimes some forests, there's a forest fire, or sometimes there's a storm and trees die, and it creates gaps in the forest. So there's kind of this always uneven age or dynamic in our forest. The way we currently oftentimes manage our forests means we plant them or we let them regenerate, they grow up and they're all the same age. And we don't have sort of this distribution of age classes within our forest, which means that it's okay for some part of its life history. But then as the forest ages and there's no new growth happening, that means a lot of animals don't have any habitat left for them. And so we know that food resources, as our forests age, and there are sort of no new blowdown areas or no regrowth of some of these plant species, there's less food available for moose. Deer, on the other hand, are going, woohoo, we like you people. Deer benefit immensely from our activities. So we fragment our forests. So we might cut down a forest, but then we build a house, or we build a parking lot, or we, have a park or something like that. So we fragment the habitat up very well in our development. And when we do that, deer are super happy. Deer are edge specialists. They also, we present a food buffet for them. If you're a gardener or if you're a forest manager, you are out there continually replanting and you're cursing the deer, but you replant everything all the time. And the deer go, thank you. And they come in and they eat it again. So essentially, our desire to have our yards and our forests look the way they do, and we select the species that we do, and we keep going in and replacing them, even though we're ticked off at the deer benefit from it. Deer also benefit from lower snow depth. So here are a couple of the big reasons why we're potentially seeing this decline in moose and an increase in deer populations. The more edges you have in your environment and the more food available for deer, the more deer you're going to see. So one of the things that I mentioned were parasites for moose and why we might have this decline in overall moose numbers. Has anybody ever heard of winter ticks? So yeah, seeing some head shaking. Yeah. So winter ticks, I mean, if you've ever had ticks on your dog, like a wood tick or a dog tick or something like that, and they're engorged, they're pretty big, right? A deer tick is even bigger. And you can imagine one of the things that happens when these ticks drop off an animal like a moose or a deer in the springtime, if they drop off into snow, they don't survive as well. But if they drop off into snow-free ground, they survive better. And that's happening more and more. And so what happens is that we have these ticks who are dropping off and not dropping off into the snow anymore. They're dropping off into the forest leaf litter and they're surviving. So tick numbers are going up and up. And here's a picture over here of a moose. If you can notice this, see how bare the shoulders are? Like you can see the dark fur here, but you can see these bare shoulders. That's because that's where the ticks hang out. So moose, unlike deer, aren't really good at grooming themselves. They're kind of a gangly animal. And they're not very good at scratching with one leg like deer can. And so what they do is they try to rub on trees or anything that they can walk under and try to get those things off their shoulders. And as they're doing that, they're dislodging the ticks, but they're also rubbing their hair off. And so when you rub your hair off, you end up looking like this. And we're starting to see this at Hubbard Brook. And this is happening not so much for older moose. So here's a slightly older moose who has a nice coat of hair. And here we are, this is in April, so this is in the springtime. But we're seeing these other younger moose who are looking a little like bare, like right there, there's a bit of a bare patch. There's still some hair. Here's another young moose with a lot of hair missing. And if you have a lot of ticks on you and you're a young moose, first of all, you're a little anemic because the ticks have been taking their blood meal. And you now are missing all this hair. And one of the things we know that's happening with climate change is in the wintertime, we used to have, and I always say this, I really dislike our winters now because it gets cold and it snows and then it warms up and then it rains and then it freezes and then it gets cold and then it gets warm and then it rains and then it freezes. So we kind of have this cycle of warm and cold and rain, not just snow, but rain. And so when these animals have lost their hair on their shoulders, and it also means they're not eating a lot, they're stressed and they're not really capable of dealing with the cold nights anymore, especially if they have wet hair and they have less hair on those shoulders. So then they experience hypothermia. And so we think that these younger moose are really susceptible to these changing conditions, and they just can't make it through. So like this guy here obviously made it through until May, but this is May. They should look a lot better than this in May. So here's one of the things that we think might be happening to moose, especially our young moose, which again is why we're seeing a decline in their overall population. Maybe the older moose are still making it, but we're not seeing the youngsters making it very long. And again, like just to sort of emphasize what's happening between moose and deer, do you guys have a lot of beaver where you are?
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, beaver. So you guys are in the epicenter of all these changes. Beavers are great. They create a lot of cool habitat, and moose love beaver ponds. It's a place where they can go cool down. They can find plants to eat, especially in the summertime. That's great. But moose don't like hanging out in a lot of high numbers. So like this one bull is the only bull who's going to hang out on this pond. If another bull comes along, he's going to like go chase him off. So that other bull's going to have to go find his own pond. If there aren't enough ponds to go stay cool at, you're just going to have to like be in a hot area and not be very happy. Deer, on the other hand, are very happy to hang out in groups. And so when beavers go ahead and build dams, they are also creating that edge habitat. So they're creating this mixed habitat availability. Again, deer are perfectly fine to hang out with more deer than just themselves. And so this becomes really successful for deer. Moose like this habitat, but they can only access one moose for one pond area. So there's just not enough ponds to go around. So what happens if we start to transition our forest to moose, from moose to deer? First of all, moose eat a lot more and they produce a lot more feces. But the big difference between moose and deer is that deer eat a lot more different kinds of plants. Again, in your own forest, in your own gardens, you know that deer eat pretty much anything. And even if the tag says it's deer resistant, you know it's not. Yeah. Pretty soon they gain an appreciation for eating anything. And again, what's interesting, moose don't select plants based on their nitrogen content, but deer do. So deer are targeting plants that have a high nitrogen content. And again, here we go in that transition of your forest. If you got a lot of deer coming in and eating in your forest, they're eating the plants that have the highest nitrogen content. If they eat those trees down or those plants down and they don't persist in your community, you're now transitioning over to the plants that have less nitrogen. So you're totally changing the community dynamics of your forest once you got a lot of deer moving in. So I'm really, figuring out up at Hubbard Brook how this transition between a lot of moose and more deer is going to impact our forest. The advantage at Hubbard Brook, which is not your advantage, is that at Hubbard Brook, we have a forest that is large, surrounded by more forest. We're in the White Mountains. And forests themselves are not great places for deer to hang out in. There can be a few deer, but there's not a lot of food. If you are living in an area where you have a small forest and you have a lot of urban or agricultural or ex-urban places, you're in a prime spot for high deer density. So even though at Hubbard Brook, we might start to see a decline in moose and we see more deer, we're never going to have high deer numbers where we are, unless something dramatically changes in our environment. That's not your case, however, and that's not the case for a lot of folks where you've got your smaller forested areas surrounded by or in contact with those places that are really great for deer to come in and get a lot more food. So this brings me to the last part, which is I go out and I study soils and I dig up plants and we take water samples and we do all that kind of stuff. To understand how moose and deer are changing at Hubbard Brook, I started this wildlife monitoring project with motion detecting cameras. So some of the pictures you saw previously are from these cameras, and we have now been collecting, continuously monitoring our wildlife at Hubbard Brook since 2018. So we've got 2 terabytes worth of images, and I've got a whole bunch of undergraduate students who like go through and check all these cards that we go out and collect. And what we've been able to sort of begin to paint a picture of is, what are our animals doing? Who do we see at Hubbard Brook? And are we seeing them consistently across the years and across different seasons? And so here's a moose with her calf, and this is in June. So we can sort of look at phenology, like when are these animals having their babies? Are they eating things? So here's a fox with a snowshoe hare in his mouth. Here is a moose eating balsam fir. So he's actually got balsam fir in his mouth that he chewed off from right up here on these upper branches. So these cameras are giving us great insights into what these animals are doing. And this is the list of animals that we have seen up at Hubbard Brook: black bear, coyote, flying squirrel, mink, porcupine, raccoon, red squirrels, white-tailed deer, barred owl, ruffed grouse, bobcat, fisher, marten, moose, rabbit, red fox, river otter, northern harriers, turkeys. So lots and lots of animals show up on these cameras. I love these cameras because this is an unobtrusive way to go in and just see what these animals are doing. And then we can do lots of stuff with the image data that we collect, the data that we collect. We can break it up into the seasons that we see these animals, and we can look at, these are camera stations that are numbered 1 through, I can't remember, I don't know how many cameras are on here. You guys are all in my my view right now. I can't see the end of my scale here.
26?
Yes, good. They're 26. Great. Yes, there are 26 cameras. Thank you, Jessica. Camera 1 is closest to the Forest Service headquarters. So this is on the eastern edge of the valley. And as we move out to camera 26, we're going out along this road out to the western edge of our valley. So here you can see where all of our camera stations are located across this valley region. And what we get to find out is, how are these animals distributing themselves across the landscape? And we can do a bunch of cool things with this. So we can break this up into the seasons. And I like to look at our 4 seasons to see which animals are moving around based on snow depth. And here in the wintertime, we tend to see coyote and moose in these purple circles and red fox in these pink circles. So those are the animals who are most active in the wintertime that we actually capture on our cameras. And coyotes go all the way over here to the Forest Service headquarters, and coyotes are kind of roaming all around. Now you'll notice we don't have a lot of activity up here on the way far western edge of the valley. So these animals are concentrating in places where there's a lot of good food availability for them. Now move to the spring and we start to see deer. So deer who are limited by deep snow start to come back in. The deer are hanging out in the lower elevation areas kind of around here over the winter. And now as soon as spring hits and the snow melts, we start to see deer throughout the valley. We're still seeing a crossover between moose and deer. If we move now to the summertime, we can see we've got deer everywhere. Deer are going everywhere, but we're starting to pick up black bears. And I mentioned black bears because now here in the fall time, we start to see black bears who are moving around a lot more, getting ready to fatten up for the winter hibernation. And this is when fawns and moose calves might be most susceptible to predation. So if those calves or fawns aren't in good enough shape and aren't large enough at that point in time, these bears are potentially one of the predators who might be decreasing these moose calf and deer fawn populations. So I think, oh, I thought I would end with a couple pictures.
Whoops,
Yes.
sorry. Do you have a significant bear population?
So I wouldn't say a significant bear population, but they have definitely increased since I've been there. So we used to see them infrequently, and now it looks like we have about 4 or 5 bear who are like adult bears who are continually in the area.
Huh.
which is great. I mean, I think it's great that we have bear back
Yeah.
again, and bear are persistent within our environment.
Interesting.
Yeah. So again, these cameras are great. We can pick up, here we have fawns and we have moose calves, and here we have these guys are growing up in the it's great because you can see them in the summertime or the spring, and then you can see them in the fall. Over here we have late November, and here's a moose calf, this little guy, hopefully, like, here's mom's nose right there. So she's brought him to a good place to eat, and looks like he's eating right now. So it's, again, these cameras have really given us the opportunity to see how these animals are doing all year round, and not just picking up their feces, which is what we typically would do, but we actually get to see, are they doing what we think they might be doing? And does it give us insights into how they're surviving? Look at that big boy. And so when you think about those females who are raising their calves, and those calves are drinking milk over the summer, these males equally as energetically expensive to build these big antlers. So both males and females really need high quality food resources if they're going to do well. And I love, we've got a pair of coyotes, and I think we have a couple pairs. This was in 2019. I started off this slideshow with another pair of coyotes, so a different pair of coyotes. So we definitely have a persistent group of coyotes who are being able to earn a living and hang out in the forest. So in my mind, when I get to see all of these different species, that indicates that, the forest is actually in pretty decent shape. So here's a bear coming into the screen here. This is in the spring, and in the early spring or beginning of summer, if you will, that bear is actually looking in pretty good shape. So it's not only can we see what they're doing, but we also get some insight into their overall fitness. So whether it's those bare shoulders on the moose calves, or we get to see the condition of their coats, or how much fat they might have on them. Again, this gives us a sense of how well these animals are doing in the space. And a bobcat. So yeah, if you guys, and yeah, so that's that.
Wow. Lynn, is this forest, I mean, are there tourists in the forest? I don't know, and I'm embarrassed to say. Can you give us a sort of synopsis? Are people tromping around, or is this really?
Well, I didn't put in any of the pictures. There are a bunch of researchers tromping around, and it's not that busy. The Hubbard Brook, it's a experimental forest run by the U.S. Forest Service. And there are trails that are available open for hiking because it's in the White Mountains. So this is public land. So this is part of the national forest. And, people come and hike through all the time. There are specific hiking trails. There are certain places that are less accessible by like just regular day hikers, but people can go anywhere in the forest. Again, it is a research forest, and so there are lots of different experiments and projects that are going on. Ian Halm is the site manager, and so I'm part of what's called the RAC, the Research Advisory Committee. And so we keep track of who's doing what research, where is that research going on, is somebody's research going to interfere with somebody else's research? There are big scale experiments going on. There are small scale, plot scale experiments that go on. So it's a pretty busy forest in the summertime. There has been a bird crew monitoring bird territories for over 50 years. So this is also a really long-term site, a little bit like Harvard Forest. So Harvard Forest also has a long history of that research. So as a research working forest, trying to understand how changes in the environment, how forestry practices are going to impact the forest and other parts of the forest has been, again, a long history at Hubbard Brook. Oh, Allison,
Could I add a little to that?
Please do.
Yeah. What this forest is basically one side of a small mountain with 7 streams coming down to Hubbard Brook and Mirror Lake, which is one of the purest lakes in place. And the original studies way back when, what they did was document acid rain. They were the people who documented acid rain coming from, unfortunately, my home state of Ohio to the Northeast. It is not part of the bigger White Mountains where everybody goes hiking and the trails are worn down and everybody's collecting their 4,000 footers. There aren't that many hikers in Hubbard Brook. In fact, there are a lot of people in Woodstock, New Hampshire, which is where this is, just south of Franconia Notch, who don't know what Hubbard Brook is. They don't even know it's there.
Yep.
But there's, 7 streams that come down this mountain?
Well, so there's 9. So there's 9 watersheds. Yeah.
Okay. So, and there are weirs on all these streams where they measure the content of the water, the flow of the water, what chemicals are in there, blah, 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 blah. It goes on and on. They have 60 years of samples of water from Mirror Lake so that somebody can apply to have 1 drop of the water from 60 years ago to compare to now. It's a fascinating place, but it's not a tourist center at all.
Yeah, yeah.
That's farther north in Franconia Notch and on the eastern side of the White Mountains.
Yeah.
Does that clarify?
Yeah,
Yes.
in a lot of ways, it's a pretty, and I mean, no disrespect to the forest, it's a pretty unremarkable forest, meaning there's no places that you can get up to the top of a peak to get a view, which is why a lot of people don't want to go there. So when you go hiking through some of the trails that run through Hubbard Brook, you're hiking through the forest. So it's not like you're going to see anything different, and you can't go get those high peak views or get those big expansive vistas, which is a good thing in my mind. Because people aren't coming there to as Allison said, to, check off their boxes for making the high peak hikes.
For their Instagram accounts. Do you, of course, now my question is fleeing my mind. Well, here's a different question. Do you feel optimistic about the moose population, or, it's such a, when one watches PBS Nature and all these programs, it just looks so grim. The ticks alone are so staggeringly awful, and to watch these creatures, it's heartbreaking. And we all know, I mean, the ticks are, I'm pulling them off our creatures here, and I'm not sure what to, I'm not sure what to think about it. And I am not, I love the deer, but it's difficult to have these discussions without, wondering about balance that is so unbalanced. It's really something, at least in our suburb.
Yeah, well, I think one of the, important things, and I teach students, and we're always talking doom and gloom, right? Because climate change is like, oh, the world is dying. And it's like, yeah, we are having a major impact. Absolutely. Talking about the numbers of turtles lost, talking about lots of animals that are lost. But the other remarkable part about our planet is how, given an opportunity, species will persist. So for the moose example, we might, again, I started off the story with, we locally killed off like a lot of animals because we overhunted them, we changed the habitat. We didn't have the same numbers of chemicals or pesticides or other things in our environment that we do today, but we dramatically wiped out a bunch of animals and forests and land, and it's come back, so We might in the short term have moose extirpated from the area again because they're not going to be able to handle the higher temperatures. They're going to increase that mortality. There's something else interesting with the ticks. If there are so few moose, meaning that they very seldom come into contact, and if that's the primary food resource for these ticks, those tick populations will plummet. So, if densities of animals get high so that there's transmission between them, we're going to see, a lot of transmission, which means that we have this positive feedback. So we're going to see a lot of mortality in moose. But if we have fewer animals and we start to see tick numbers go down, then there's less probability that the moose are going to encounter these ticks. And so if populations go down to a point where, now the population stabilized at this really low level, you'll almost never see one, but at least they're still out there. So that could also happen. But again, life is amazingly resilient. Give it a little bit of an opportunity, just give it a little bit of a chance, and life will happen.
Does anyone else have any questions? I've got one percolating. You feel like, have you noticed an incredible increase in the deer population over all of those years of observing? And I'm assuming that there's no hunting allowed in this.
No, actually, people can hunt there.
Okay. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So on my cameras, I have hunters walking up, showing me their guns on my cameras. And it's like, yeah, there are certain things you cannot do in that forest. But you can, people can still hunt in that area as long as you have your license and everything else. And so when we're out in the woods during hunting season, it's like you have to wear your orange, go during the middle of the day. So everybody's cautious about what you're doing out in the field. Yes, I've seen more deer, but again, I'm not seeing the same density of deer. Now, Nat Clevitt studies orchids. She studies a lot of trees in the forest, but she's particularly interested in orchids as well. Deer love spring ephemerals. So Nat is particularly unhappy about the increase in deer numbers at Hoverbrook because they do go around, they eat the trillium, they eat the ladies' tresses. Yeah, so they eat the trout lilies. So they go around, they eat a lot of those flowers. So Nat is now, we've actually put cameras on some of her orchids that she's been monitoring for a really long time, like 20 years that Nat's been monitoring the orchids. And we put cameras on some of those orchids and like, we've gotten a deer coming in and like, she's like, there it is. It ate my flower.
Oh gosh.
Yeah, they are something. I mean, yeah. I think in our town, we have these sort of ups and downs about what to do about the deer or what not to do, and it's just a tricky conversation. Yeah.
Yes. We actually do a cull at Vassar, and we've been doing that since 2010. I work on some other deer plots in this local area where there's hunting, different kinds of hunting that go on. And yeah, we have protests every year. Yeah. So maybe as a Vassar alum, you haven't gotten, the memos?
No, I have not. Yeah. So are you culling, just to go slightly off topic, are they culling where there's that big sort of farm?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Huh. And what happens to the meat, or what happens to the carcasses?
So hunters helping the hungry, the meat is processed by the hunters, and then that goes to the food pantries.
Okay.
Okay, I want to say thank you, Lynn. I have to tune off.
Yes, it was wonderful.
Made dinner reservations.
Yes, it was wonderful seeing you, Allison, and I look forward to a cake in the future.
Yeah, with moose droppings in it, right?
I
It
know.
looked like a
No, they were chocolate. They were chocolate.
I know. But, and I found them, so they were delicious.
Okay,
It's good
thank
to
you
see you,
very much.
Allison.
Bye, Allison. So if people don't have any other pressing questions, we should let Lynn go and eat or have more wine. But I thank you. And I love hearing about the incredible people that we have, like you, doing this research that's what keeps me going, is this flood of it warms my heart, that maybe things aren't happening fast enough at, different at the federal level or, state by state, but we just know that there are people like you out there. The amount of knowledge and information that's been compiled and that will be used in so many different ways is just incredible. And I find it, it's endlessly fascinating. And these creatures moose in particular, are such a noble, they're just an iconic, incredible figure. And the only time I've lived here my whole life in the sort of, New England and New York area. The one job I ever had in Alaska was full month of January. And I finally got to see these creatures close and just they're like out of a fairy tale. They're so incredible. So I envy you. And thank you all so much. I'm sorry. I think I'm going to go and check all the technology because I have a horrible feeling that there was a glitch of some kind. But those of us who are here, I think we really appreciated your talk, Lynn. Thank you. And I'll go back to Vassar and torture you.
Oh, that sounds great. Well, yeah. I look forward to hearing, what your land trust is doing in the future. Land trusts are a really important way that pieces of land get sort of conserved or preserved. And then thinking about the integration. So the reason we do the science is so that we can help other folks who are making those kinds of decisions, the decisions that you all are making. So yeah, if you ever want to reach out, definitely Hubbard Brook and the Research Foundation and those of us who work there are always happy to talk to land trusts such as yourselves.
Thank you very much. Fantastic. So thank you all. Is there a tiny thing in the chat here? Thank you. This is a thank you to everyone. Thank you, Lynn. That's great.
Great.
Yeah,
all right. Well,
you.
Everybody enjoy the coming spring and put your high socks and your boots.
Yeah.
Critters.
Well,
good night, everyone. Oh, sorry.
Good night. If you come to Vassar, definitely let me know.
I will. Watch out. Okay,
Yeah.
bye. Thank you all. Good night. Good night.
Thank you.